you know? When you sit behind that desk in the highest office, you learn very quickly that every word you speak carries weight, not just political weight. I'm talking about the kind of weight that can move markets, that can send young men and women into danger, that can change the trajectory of millions of lives in an instant. It's a responsibility that stays with you every day, every hour. And it should. Now, look, I want to talk to you today about something that happened just this past Saturday morning, November 29th, 2025. The current administration sent out a message on social media declaring that the airspace over and around Venezuela should be considered closed in its entirety. Now, when I first read those words, I had to stop and think about what that actually means. We're not talking about closing a restaurant or shutting down a road for repairs. We're talking about sovereign airspace. We're talking about a declaration that carries massive implications for international law, for regional stability, for the lives of ordinary people trying to visit their families, do business, or just live their lives. Here's what concerns me, and we'll come back to this in a moment. The way this announcement was made tells us something important, not just about Venezuela policy, but about how decisions that affect American security, our constitutional system, and our standing in the world are being communicated. And I think most people have no idea what's really coming because of this. So let me explain it to you step by step the way I would have wanted someone to explain it to me. Now, before we get into what happened on Saturday, we need to understand the bigger picture here. Venezuela isn't just some distant country we can ignore. It's right here in our hemisphere, just a few hours' flight from Miami. And for decades, Venezuela mattered to us not just because of oil, though they have some of the largest reserves in the world, but because we shared democratic values, economic ties, and a commitment to regional stability. But something happened over the past 25 years. First under one leader and now under another. Venezuela has descended into authoritarianism. We're talking about a country where people are fleeing by the millions because they can't find food, medicine, or basic security, where democratic institutions have been hollowed out, where opposition leaders are arrested for speaking their minds. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, plain and simple. Now, let me be clear about something. There are real problems here that the United States has to address. The drug trafficking coming out of Venezuela has contributed to the opioid crisis, killing Americans in every community across this country. Human trafficking networks exploit vulnerable people. And yes, the current regime has shown no respect for human rights or democratic norms. These are legitimate concerns, and those who have held positions of responsibility have dealt with their share of challenges in Latin America, from various nations facing crises to complex regional dynamics. I understand that sometimes you need to apply pressure, but here's what experience teaches. Lasting solutions in our hemisphere come from working with our neighbors, not dictating to them. They come from building coalitions with Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, the Organization of American States. They come from supporting civil society, promoting democracy, and applying multilateral pressure. Because when the United States acts alone, without partners, without a clear legal framework, we risk making things worse, not better. So let me explain exactly what happened on Saturday morning, because the details here really matter. Around 8 in the morning, the administration posted this message on social media. To all airlines, pilots, drug traffickers, and human traffickers, please consider the airspace over and around Venezuela as closed in its entirety. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Now, when I read that, I thought, this is either a major military operation that's been carefully planned or something has gone terribly wrong in the decision-making process. So reporters, good journalists doing their job, started calling U.S. officials. And here's what they found. Officials were surprised by the announcement. The Pentagon didn't respond to requests for comment. The White House didn't provide any additional explanation. According to news agencies, U.S. officials were unaware of any ongoing U.S. military operation to enforce a closure of Venezuelan airspace. Let that settle for a moment. We're talking about declaring another country's airspace closed, which could mean a no-fly zone, which could mean military enforcement, which could mean shooting down aircraft. And our own military officials found out the same way you and I did. through social media. A retired Air Force Lieutenant General, a man who actually commanded a no-fly zone over northern Iraq in the late 90s. So he knows what he's talking about. He said the administration's announcement raises more questions than answers. He said imposing a no-fly zone would require significant resources and planning. And then he said something that really stuck with me. The devil's in the details. Meanwhile, 6 major international airlines had already suspended flights to Venezuela after the FAA issued a warning about a worsening security situation and increased military activity. Venezuela responded by revoking operating rights for those airlines. And here's something else. Those deportation flights bringing nearly 1,400 Venezuelans back home are now suspended too. Now, look, this is where I need to be frank with you about what really concerns me. And it's not about partisan politics. It's about how we govern, how we make decisions that could lead to military conflict, how we protect our constitutional system when proper procedures are followed. If we were to implement something as serious as closing another country's airspace, which is essentially an act of war under international law, here's what would happen. The National Security Council would meet. We'd have the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA Director, legal counsel, all in the same room. We'd game out the scenarios. We'd ask the hard questions. What's our legal authority? What are the risks? What happens if this goes wrong? How do our allies respond? What's our exit strategy? And then, and this is crucial, we brief congressional leadership because the Constitution gives them the power to authorize military force, not just the president. That's not bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. That's how you avoid catastrophic mistakes. That's how you make sure that when American service members are put in harm's way, it's for a clear mission with clear objectives and clear legal authority. You don't announce a no-fly zone the way you announce a sale at a car dealership. You don't make policy that could risk American lives and international stability through a social media post that your own Pentagon hasn't seen. Let me tell you something. When your military commanders find out about major operations through social media at the same time as the general public, that's not leadership. That's chaos. Here's the honest truth. Governing by social media can feel decisive. It can play well to certain audiences, but it's dangerous because decisions made in isolation, without institutional checks, without expert advice, without congressional oversight, those are the decisions that lead to quagmires, to unintended consequences, to outcomes nobody wanted. We have to remember that the careful, deliberative process our founders built into our system isn't there to slow things down. It's there to make sure we get things right. Now, let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. When major policy decisions are announced on social media without going through appropriate channels, it doesn't just affect one situation, it damages the entire structure of how our government is supposed to work. Think about what happened here. Career diplomats at the State Department, military planners at the Pentagon, intelligence analysts at the CIA. These are professionals who spent their entire lives serving our country, regardless of which party is in power. And they woke up on Saturday morning finding out about a potential military operation from a social media post. What does that do to morale? What does that do to their ability to plan, coordinate, execute policy effectively? How can our military commanders brief their troops on a mission when they themselves don't know the mission? And it's not just about our own institutions. Think about our allies. Colombia shares a border with Venezuela. They've taken in millions of Venezuelan refugees. Brazil has security concerns. Mexico is dealing with migration pressures. These countries need to know what the United States is doing because it directly affects them. But instead of diplomatic consultations, instead of coordinated strategy, they're also reading about it on social media. That's not how you build coalitions. That's how you lose trust. Now, let's talk about international law, because this isn't some abstract concept. It matters. Under the United Nations Charter, every nation has sovereignty over its airspace. You can't just declare another country's airspace closed unless you're prepared to enforce it militarily. And that raises serious legal questions. The Venezuelan government called the administration's announcement a colonialist threat and a violation of international law. Now, there's no sympathy for the current regime, but when we act unilaterally without legal justification, without international support, we hand them a propaganda victory. We prove their narrative that the United States doesn't respect sovereignty, or international norms. Here's what experience teaches. American leadership isn't just about power. It's about legitimacy. It's about showing the world that we act according to principles, not just impulses. When we undermine that legitimacy, we undermine our ability to lead, to build coalitions, to resolve problems peacefully, and that makes America less safe, not more. Now, let's talk about what the administration might be trying to accomplish here, because I think it's important to understand the strategy, or at least what the strategy appears to be, before judging whether it's going to work. From what we know, there's been a massive U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean over the past few months. We've conducted strikes against vessels suspected of drug trafficking off Venezuela's coast. The CIA has been authorized to conduct covert operations inside the country. And just last week, we found out there actually was a phone call between U.S. leadership and the Venezuelan leader himself. So this isn't happening in isolation. This is part of what the administration calls a maximum pressure campaign designed to force the regime out of power, or at least compel them to stop drug trafficking and human rights abuses. Now, look, I understand the appeal of maximum pressure when you're dealing with a dictator who's caused immense suffering, who's facilitated drug trafficking, who's shown no willingness to negotiate in good faith. Yes, pressure can be necessary. But here's the question we have to ask. Is this approach actually going to work? And what are the risks if it doesn't work? Here's what concerns me. When you corner a regime like this, when you threaten their survival, they don't just give up. History shows us they dig in, they rally nationalist sentiment, they use external threats to justify internal repression. The leader can stand before his people and say, see, the American empire is trying to invade us, just like I've been telling you. And that actually strengthens his hand internally, especially with the military leadership that keeps him in power. And then there are the unintended consequences. What if this escalates into actual military conflict? We're talking about potential civilian casualties, a refugee crisis that makes the current situation look small, destabilization throughout the region. What about the Colombian peace process? What about the millions of Venezuelans already living in neighboring countries? What about U.S. service members who might be asked to enforce a no-fly zone without clear rules of engagement? Experience shows that the best outcomes come from sustained, coordinated pressure, not from shooting first and asking questions later. So let me tell you what I think is coming and why every American needs to pay attention to this, because the consequences are going to touch all of us in one way or another. First scenario, commercial airlines take the administration's declaration seriously and stop flying over Venezuelan airspace entirely. Now, that might sound like it only affects Venezuela, but think about what that means. 28 million people, most of whom have nothing to do with the current government, become even more isolated. Families can't reunite, businesses can't operate, medical supplies become harder to get, and those deportation flights bringing Venezuelans back from the United States have already stopped. So now you have people stuck in limbo, which creates more pressure on our immigration system, not less. Second scenario, this escalates into actual military confrontation. We're already conducting strikes on vessels. We have a massive military presence in the Caribbean. If we start enforcing this airspace closure, and I mean really enforcing it with fighter jets and potential shoot-down authority, we're talking about a completely different level of conflict. And here's what keeps me up at night. What are the rules of engagement? What if there's a civilian aircraft in distress? What if Venezuela, backed by Russia or China, decides to test our resolve? These aren't theoretical questions. These are life or death decisions that need answers before we go down this path. Third scenario, and this might be the most likely. We end up in a prolonged stalemate where pressure increases but the regime doesn't give in. Meanwhile, ordinary Venezuelans suffer more. The refugee crisis intensifies. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Panama become overwhelmed, and eventually, guess where many of those refugees try to go? They head north, toward our border. So the very problem we're trying to solve, migration, instability, security threats, actually gets worse. And there's something else we need to think about. What message does this send to the rest of the world? China's watching, Russia's watching. Every adversary is taking notes about how the United States makes decisions, how predictable we are, whether our institutions hold, and every ally is wondering, can we trust the United States to act responsibly? Now look, I want to bring this home because I think we need to be clear about what kind of country we want to be and how we want to solve problems like Venezuela. Here's what I believe. The United States is at its best when we lead through our values, not just our military power. When we build coalitions instead of acting alone. When we respect the constitutional process our founders gave us, not because it's easy or convenient, but because it protects us from making catastrophic mistakes. The separation of powers, congressional oversight, the deliberative process, these aren't obstacles to effective governance. They're the foundation of it. Venezuela is a real problem that demands real solutions. No one should be naive about that. The current regime has caused immense suffering. Drug trafficking is killing Americans. The humanitarian crisis is destabilizing an entire region. We need to act, but we need to act in ways that reflect who we are as a nation. That means working with our allies in Latin America. That means supporting democratic movements within Venezuela. That means multilateral sanctions, diplomatic pressure, humanitarian assistance to refugees, and support for free and fair elections when the opportunity comes. What it shouldn't mean are unilateral declarations on social media that bypass our own military, ignore Congress, and violate international norms. We have to do better than that. The American people deserve leaders who understand that the awesome power of the presidency comes with awesome responsibility. Responsibility to consult, to deliberate, to build consensus, to follow the law. Here's the honest truth. There are still reasons to believe in America's capacity to correct course. We've seen it happen before. When citizens stay informed, when they demand accountability from their representatives, when they insist that we live up to our democratic ideals, that's when change happens. That's when we remember that in a democracy, ultimate power belongs to the people, not to any one person, no matter what office they hold. The message for you is this: pay attention, ask questions, demand that your elected officials, regardless of party, explain how decisions are being made and whether they're following constitutional processes, because democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires all of us. We have to remember what makes America exceptional, and there are reasons to believe we can.